So that's everything for housekeeping. So I'll turn it over now to Christine Kirby from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Thanks for joining us today, Christine.
Thank you, Maggie, and good afternoon. My name is Christine Kirby. I am the Assistant Commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection for the Bureau of Air and Waste. I am very pleased to welcome all of you to MassDEP's second stakeholder meeting, and we're here to gather your input on developing regulations for including cumulative impact analyses. You'll see that we're referring to it sometimes as CIA. That's the acronym. So we'll be talking about including those analyses in certain categories of MassDEP's air quality permits. This meeting continues a very important process for the Commonwealth and MassDEP, and we want to ensure that all interested stakeholders are engaged in this important process. For today, we want to highlight again the legislation that Governor Baker signed on March 26, 2021, just this past March. The name of the legislation is an act creating a next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy. And for short, we refer to it as the climate law. So the law contained a new section for MassDEP, and it directed us to evaluate and seek input and public comment on incorporating cumulative impact analyses into certain permits, and to propose regulations within 18 months requiring cumulative impact analyses in certain air permits. That provision is the subject of this meeting and subsequent meetings planned through April of 2022 next year. And further information on our process and how you can be involved is available on our website. I know we've provided a link, but if you Google MassDEP cumulative impact analysis and air quality permitting, it comes right up. So we have a goal of presenting a conceptual approach early next year and proposed regulations by next fall. That's just a review of what we've already discussed. And for today's session, this afternoon, we'll be reviewing terminology used in this complex topic. We'll be describing some of the data used in a cumulative impact analysis, including some of the recent innovative screening tools, including our own tool developed by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. You'll hear more about that in a bit, and how those tools are used. We'll also look at examples of cumulative impact analyses or similar approaches being used by other states. I'm sure many of you are following some of that work in some of our other states. And then we'll give you a detailed background. This detailed background will give us all the foundation to start examining in future meetings what we all think should be included in the cumulative impact analyses for MassDEP air quality permitting. This is all the subject, and we'll be discussing some of these issues in detail in future meetings. So we have reached out to the environmental stakeholder community, municipalities, the regulated community, environmental and business organizations, and especially environmental justice communities and organizations to participate in this important process. And we're very pleased to see you here again today. So we had great turnout for the last sessions, the first two sessions we had at the end of August. This is our first session for the second round, and we'll be back again here tomorrow night. That's part of our robust stakeholder process. So as part of addressing disproportionate environmental burdens, evaluating cumulative impacts is needed to ensure that communities are not overburdened by projects that may negatively affect the environment and public health. Again, we will be exploring this very complex topic of including CIA in the air permitting process, very much with your help and insight. So again, I want to thank you for your participation. We're really happy and pleased to have you here, and I'll turn it over to Joanne. Thank you.
All right. Okay, just a minute. Just having trouble getting my video back on. There we go. Sorry. All right.
Oh, Joanne, we still can't see you. Just want to share your.
I know. It's the video. I click it on and then it goes off. Maggie.
Yeah, so on your Zoom control panel.
I know controls keep disappearing.
Oh.
So, okay. There we go.
Perfect.
All right. Hello, everybody. Sorry about that. Hello, my name is Joanne Moore, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Air and Climate Division for the Bureau of Air and Waste and DEP. And I'm happy to be here again. This is our agenda for this afternoon. As you know, Christine Kirby led it off, our Assistant Commissioner. I'm going to be going through some terminology, followed by Cindy Baird. And then examples of, she will be reviewing data sources and mapping tools. And then Glen Keith will be going over examples of other state permit programs that have been using cumulative impact analysis. And then we're going to have some time, hopefully, for some discussion. So that's the agenda for today. Okay. So we have posed some questions here for you to consider as you listen to this presentation. What does the issue of cumulative impacts mean to you? What are your major priorities or concerns with respect to cumulative impacts? What are the types of cumulative impacts that are of greatest concern? What characteristics should be considered in a cumulative impact analysis? For example, public health only or socioeconomic issues, timescale, impacts with both positive and negative aspects. What community information should be included in a cumulative impact analysis? We're going to come back to these questions at the end of our presentation, and we're just raising these issues to help you participate in this dialogue, and that it will help you kind of consider these questions as you're listening. And we're hoping that it helps you to formulate questions or comments that would help you better participate in a discussion at the end of our presentations. There are many terms when we're talking about cumulative impact assessment, and we felt it was important that we highlight some of the more significant terms and distinguish how they are different from each other. So we often look at risk in air permitting and other types of analyses. Risk is really a calculated probability. It's really a quantitative number. And you often hear about it like the cancer risk from inhaling a toxic compound for a certain number of hours a day over a lifetime. In regulatory programs, it often establishes a numerical standard reflecting acceptable risk that could be used in a decision-making process. A risk assessment can look at a single compound, such as being exposed to a single chemical, or it could be a cumulative risk assessment that considers the combined effects from multiple agents. And these agents are sometimes called a stressor. And we're going to be using that term a lot in cumulative impact analysis. And a stressor really can just be broadly defined as anything that causes a negative effect. Now, moving beyond quantifying risks, a health impact assessment looks more broadly to a range of stressors that might affect the health of a population or community as a result of a proposed project or a plan. This type of assessment involves moves beyond the quantitative risk to a broad set of potential health impacts that are often described generally in a more qualitative manner than the quantitative we just talked about in a numerical risk assessment. Now, looking at cumulative impacts in this California EPA example, at the broadest level, we have an assessment of cumulative impacts. A cumulative impact assessment looks at all possible impacts from the individual stressors that you wish to include, that you feel are important to a particular project. Those environmental health stressors that could possibly impact that particular community. At this time, there's really no set or commonly accepted formula on how to add up those individual stressors that go into it. It can take into and account for the vulnerability of sensitive populations. That can be different ages or different health conditions or such things as minority populations. Also notice in this definition that it does include where applicable and to the extent data are available. So different data can be used in determining cumulative impacts. And again, that implies that there is no really set formula or calculation method on any particular, in terms of generally on cumulative impact analysis. So it's interesting, this topic is getting talked about quite broadly, and it's quite important really across the nation. And just last week, EPA's Office of Research and Development held a listening session for states to solicit input on research needs and priorities on the topic of cumulative impact assessment. At that session, EPA presented an interim draft definition of cumulative impacts. It grounds that definition to the total burden on certain circumstances in a given period of time to the community you're concerned with. And then it speaks to the total effects from stressors and all other activities. The concept of cumulative impact analysis has been closely linked to addressing environmental justice. So it's important, we want to recognize here, as defined in the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, or as the acronym EEA, their updated June 2021 environmental justice policy that defines environmental justice as equal protection and meaningful involvement of people, and directs us to develop these regulations with meaningful involvement and equitable distribution of environmental benefits. That EEA's environmental justice policy also defines vulnerable health environmental justice populations. Now, these are segments of the population that have higher evidence of higher than average rates of environmentally related health outcomes. So higher than average rates of a particular health outcome. And these have been defined as the particular ones of higher than average rates of childhood asthma, low birth rate, childhood lead poisoning, and health disease morbidity. This definition calls on EEA agencies to focus special attention on these populations that already experience greater health effects from environmental stressors. In other words, vulnerable health justice populations. Based on this definition, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health developed an EJ tool that identifies cities and towns that meet vulnerable health EJ criteria and provides information on those health outcome rates. And you're going to hear more about that tracking tool from Sandy Baird in just a few minutes. Many EJ efforts are focused on addressing disproportionate impacts, which basically what that means is it represents a pattern in the population of greater exposure to multiple and cumulative environmental and health stressors impacting a community, which is typically an environmental justice population. So let's see if we can tie all of that together, all those definitions together. So I think the slide does a nice job of doing that. So, and the way we put this together is to say, so why are we interested in all of this and all of these and all of these definitions? So cumulative impacts results when there's an effect of an action that when they're added together to other effects in a particular the effects of an action that are added together to other effects in a particular place and within a particular time. There are places where people already are having a higher burden of environmental pollution that contributes to increased vulnerability. And many of the people that have a greater burden of effects are people of color or have lower incomes or have lower ability to speak English. These are the vulnerable populations. And we want to ensure protection from environmental pollution, as well as we want to promote community involvement in planning and environmental decision-making to maintain or enhance the environmental quality of these neighborhoods and all neighborhoods. So I think that summarizes not only how we think about cumulative impact, but why it's just so important to us, and important to us to implement our EEA policies. So when we think about cumulative impact as a process, it's really basically an analytical approach that looks at the combination of impacts from a project along with its past impacts, while we're also recognizing a specific population and the characteristics of that place and population. And it's conducted within community stakeholder input. So let's look at a conceptual, what would a conceptual cumulative impact analysis, what might it look like? And this is just an example. We're not sure how, this whole process and our stakeholder processes we have is part of developing what a cumulative impact assessment is going to look like for air permitting. But this might be a conceptual model of that. So step one would be you need to define your study area and your project context. And then you would look at or describe the historical and current environmental and health baseline of that project or plan area. Then you have to identify those environmental health and socioeconomic indicators that you want to consider in that cumulative impact analysis. Then you have to identify the incremental impacts of the proposed project. And then you might have a step that makes sure that you identify anything else that you think you need to look at, any other current or future actions that might have an impact that could have cumulative impacts besides what you've already identified. And then you have to assess all of those potential cumulative impacts in some manner, which is no easy task. And then number 7, finally, you have to assess, you have to make your regulatory decisions, assess mitigation, project conditions, and your regulatory review decisions. And then finally report your results. So there's a conceptual model for how a cumulative impact analysis might occur. So I'm going to stop there before we go on to Sandy, and just see if there are any questions about the information I just presented. Just raise your hand and Maggie will call on you, or put something into the chat box.
Thanks, Joanne. No questions so far, but we can give folks another minute.
Let's give it a little bit in case. Okay. Any questions, Maggie? Otherwise, I'll move on.
Nothing yet.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to Cindy Baird, and she'll introduce herself. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. That was a really nice introduction to the cumulative impact analysis process. And so my name is Sandy Baird. I am the chief of the toxicology group in the Office of Research and Standards at Massachusetts DEP. I am really pleased to be here today to talk with you about the kinds of data that can go into a cumulative impact analysis, and more specifically, the data and the way it has already been presented through mapping and screening tools that have been developed in Massachusetts as well as in other states. So just to give you an idea of what sort of is out there, many of you have probably already looked at some of those tools. So the cumulative impact analysis requires data on multiple types of information on environmental, conditions, health, and other indicators, socioeconomic or environmental justice. Information is available in Massachusetts, specific to Massachusetts, from our Department of Public Health, from MassDEP, and other agencies within Massachusetts. Next slide. There's several different existing screening tools that use various types of data on the environment and public health and different demographic data to identify the overburdened and environmental justice communities. These, help us provide insight into places that could be to help us understand what the sort of existing conditions are, and in some cases are used for triggering additional analyses. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about several of these tools, which include the tool from Massachusetts Department of Public Health, EPA's EJ screen, California EnviroScreen, and NADA and TRI databases. There's a lot of benefits to these screening and mapping tools. It's been really exciting to see this data become available, at the click of a button, and really for us to get a real sense of where things are located, where we're located, where facilities are located, where other pollution sources and other resources are available. And it's been really helpful, I think, to individuals and agencies to better understand these local and community conditions. And as these mapping tools are developed, they've been developed by different organizations for sort of different purposes and at different points in time. And so not everybody's developed the tool in the same way. And so I'm going to show you some examples of that. So there's sort of two basic sort of types that I consider these mapping and screening tools. Like one just presents one indicator at a time. So you can see, if you want to see what the, where the EJ populations are, you can see that. And if you want to see what the health indicators are, that you have to go to a different screen and you would see that. So you can't look at them at the same time. Others combine two or more indicators to create a score. And that can also be useful. But the going into a score means that you've made some judgments about what is more important, if they're equal, and that is sort of part of the heart of developing these tools. There's also different ways that people present the information. One way, which I'll show you next, is that the actual value of the indicator is presented. So if it's 5, you see 5. If it's 10, you see 10. Another way that information is presented is that they're compared to some other point, like the state average or the national average. And so then the data would be presented as typically broken down into percentiles. So on a scale of 1 to 100, you might be, a particular place might be in the 5th percentile, another place might be in the 80th percentile, or you could use a score, typically sort of broken into either a scale of 1 to 10 or a scale of 1 to 100. So the first tool I'm going to discuss is our Massachusetts Department of Public Health has an environmental justice tool. And this tool presents the indicators that have been selected in the 2021 environmental justice policy at EEA, as Joanne was mentioning, and allows us to see Massachusetts environmental justice communities by block group and by community. In addition, it allows us to identify vulnerable health communities using the 4 indicators that are part of that policy. So those are sort of the core of this, but you can also use this tool to look at where facilities are in Massachusetts, where buildings, schools, highways, energy generation. So there's each of these mapping tools has different layers that you can access as you go through the, as you get more familiar with the tool. Next slide, please. So this slide shows you a screenshot of the environmental justice data and report summary from the DPH environmental justice tool. And here we see the states, in the entire state, separated by community, and in this map, the green squares are showing all the communities that contain at least one environmental justice neighborhood. And in general, environmental justice neighborhood is defined by meeting some of the EJ, one of the 4 EJ screening criteria. And then the yellow communities, as shown in this map, are communities that are an EJ community and also meet at least one of the vulnerable health criteria. So this sort of shows us, it doesn't show gradations, it shows where a community has met that criteria. One of the things that's really nice about this tool is that if you're interested in a particular community, you can then click on the link of just the community's name and get more information on that particular community right from this map. And also this table, you can scroll and you can see what the criteria were, which criteria were the ones that made them an EJ community or EJ vulnerable health community. The next slide, please. So at the national level, EPA has developed EJ Screen, which I think many people have seen this tool, and it's been available online for, I think, maybe 10 years now. It has a series of indicators sorted into environmental indicators and demographic indicators. And it uses these individually as for individual environmental indicators and individual demographic indicators, but it also provides a way of combining one particular environmental indicator with some demographic information to create what is called an EJ index. The EJ Screen, like the DPA, Massachusetts Department of Public Health tool, also has other types of information that are available on the in the tool. Next slide, please. So this slide shows you a screenshot of sort of downtown Boston, and we're looking at one of the EJ indexes for ozone. And so in this case, the red means sort of worse. It shows the, so we look up on the top right-hand side, we can see the scale where it's broken into like 5% increments. And the index, as I mentioned, it includes so the number of people that are within that area and provides extra weight as part of the index. So the EJ index for ozone might look a little bit different than just the environmental indicator comparison. And this particular comparison is to the state, but this tool also allows you to compare to EPA Region 1, which is our region, and nationally. Next slide, please. So the state of California was the first state actually that developed the screening, sort of a geographic mapping screening tool. And they have, so I wanted to note that they have a draft of their 4th iteration of this process. And I think I bring that up because it's really important to realize that the cumulative impact assessment, these mapping tools are all an iterative process. And, so California is on their 3rd iteration. They've added indicators over time and, have increased, some of the tools that are available on their site, but mostly they've been able to add indicators. California uses 21 indicators. They have many indicators that are just specific to their state, which would not be included in EJ Screen. And so it provides a sort of a very useful tool for decision-making within California, where it's really used for deciding where resources should be spent to improve local environmental conditions. And it's a little map in the inset. Again, red is where they have a higher score, and green is where the score is lower. If you can show the next slide, Joanne, provides some a little graphic with the indicators where they look at exposures to different air pollutants, environmental effects, sort of distance to cleanup sites or solid waste sites, as well as population characteristics, including asthma, cardiovascular disease, and low birth weight, which are health indicators included in our EJ policy and socioeconomic indicators. So one of the things that I mentioned is that California combines these indicators into a score, and they use different weights, whether it's on the pollution burden and the population characteristics, to help to create this score. And that's work is done in the back to see how this information comes together and how things should be weighted. But it represents sort of a value of what things are important. And so it's an important piece to think about when you have like a composite score. And it's also really important to realize that the score is not a measure of health risk. Just like all these mapping tools, they are screening tools. So they give us indications of where there might be greater concern or where a particular location, but they aren't actually measuring a cumulative impact, and they are not measuring particular health risk. They are a screening tool. Next slide, please, Joanne. So just to show you another way that the public health data that is sort of comparable to that which is available on our public health, the Department of Public Health EJ tool in the state of Washington, they created their tracking tool using the same kind of data, but they present it on a risk rank on a scale of 1 to 10. And they also present them individually. It just is another way of presenting the information. Next slide, please. So in addition to the screening tools, there are efforts done at the national level to help better understand things like air toxics concentrations. And so the National Air Toxics Assessment utilizes information that's provided by all the states and then models those air concentrations at the census tract level across the entire country. This becomes a data layer that can be used. It's included in EJ Screen, which is the basis of the ozone and PM and other risk estimates that are part of EJ Screen. But this information is available for incorporation in all this with the mapping tools. But so it's an important resource. An additional resource shown on the next slide is EPA has a toxics release inventory. So facilities need to report what they are releasing into the environment. And EPA has used that information in a screening tool, the Risk Screening Environmental Indicators model, the RESI model, that looks at these individual sources and also, but then adds so what's reported is in pounds per year or some unit like that amount. And then the RESI model incorporates how these chemicals move in the environment and their toxicity associated with it. And so then that sort of provides another layer where you could look at sort of a score across different facilities and see how one facility might be more of a concern than another. And you can see that on this next slide, where I have a screenshot in the Massachusetts area, and you can see the larger purple dot, sort of like about in the middle of the slide, would represent a facility that released more, or the release was sort of considered more toxic or more available than the smaller purple dots that you can see sort of below that larger one. So it provides a way of comparing without each agency having to do the analysis. So EPA provides these on a national level. Next slide, please. So these screening and mapping tools have, a lot of benefits, and we've really, I've really enjoyed using them as a way of trying to understand what's happening in Massachusetts, and so it gives us a way to sort of access the readily available information, and both on pollution burden and population characteristics, and like health vulnerability, as in the Massachusetts Department of Public Health map. It also allows us, to look across the state and see places that might be, more of a concern or less of a concern. And, really importantly, it empowers communities, to have a better understanding of what's happening in their communities. Next slide. Along with this, these real benefits, there are limitations. Just to reiterate, these screening tools don't provide a direct measure of exposure or health risk, because we're not looking at individuals, we're looking at estimates of exposure in a location. We're looking at indicators of health risk at a community level. And so they provide indicators, but they don't provide a community risk or an individual's risk. Much of the data that's available is available at different scales because of the types of information. So like health information, because of small numbers, it's only available at a community level, whereas like say like the National Air Toxics Modeling can be modeled down to the census tract level. And so these maps have sort of different, it can complicate things when you have different levels of different spatial scales that you're dealing with. And also the data varies in quality and may not be current, in part because it takes time to collect the data, it takes time to make sure the data is accurate. And so that happens on some, periodic basis, and that people who are using the information don't have control over, and also, relates to funding that supports that sort of data. In addition, these maps may not address, all the environmental and health issues that are important to a local community, and so they can't answer all the questions, even if they were able to have greater capacity of risk. And as such, the mapping tools aren't designed to be the basis of a regulatory decision. So we wouldn't use a mapping tool as the, decision-making tool. It would be help to get us started on the path, but it would not be the end of the process. I think that was my last slide, and I just wanted to thank you, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks, Andy. No questions yet, but we did have one comment from Barry Fogle. He says, the specific scoring and weight given to various indicators is a critical piece of this process. If the scores do not represent relative health risks, then the burden assigned to each indicator needs to be developed very carefully to avoid overstating or understating each indicator.
I totally agree. Very good point.
It doesn't look like we have any other questions or comments at this time.
Okay, thank you. Glen Keith will be presenting next.
Okay, thanks, Sandy. Hi, my name is Glen Keith. I'm the director of the Air and Climate Programs Division, and I'm also happy to be here to talk and present the information. If we could go to the next slide, that would be great. So as we know, the Climate Roadmap Law signed earlier this year directs DEP to incorporate cumulative impact analysis into our regulatory air quality permit program. And as Sandy has noted, a lot of the use of cumulative impact maps and tools and analysis is geared toward identifying overburdened communities for further study or to direct mitigation resources or other resources. And that's different than using cumulative impact analysis in making a facility-specific permit decision. So we wanted to look at two examples. One is under development in New Jersey, and one that's been in place for a while in Minnesota, where these states are considering cumulative impacts specifically in regulatory permit decisions. In the case of New Jersey, they are in the process of developing rules for a variety of facilities and permit decisions as defined in their environmental justice law. And in the case of Minnesota, their process applies only to air permits, but currently is applicable only to a very small geographic area within the state. Next slide, please. So we did mention at our August stakeholder meeting that New Jersey is developing regulations that would require applicants for certain permits in overburdened communities to consider the environmental and public health stressors already borne by that community, and that those communities, overburdened communities or OBC, they are defined in the statute at the census block level. And the permit applicants would have to compare the existing burden in those communities to other non-burdened areas of the state, and then evaluate how the proposed permit action would affect the overburdened community. So this rulemaking is ongoing, and as I mentioned, in the case of New Jersey, the law defines overburdened communities. Their definition is similar to our EJ community definition. It's based on census block data, includes percent of low-income households, communities of color, limited English proficiency, et cetera. And New Jersey has mapped those communities. You can see the map there. And the New Jersey law also specifies specifically the types of facilities and the types of permits that are covered. And for us here in Massachusetts, those are still open questions. In other words, we still need to determine which air permits would require a cumulative impact analysis and potentially where geographically that would be. New Jersey held a series of 6 stakeholder meetings that wrapped up in June, and they're currently developing their regulatory proposals. So no decisions have been made. So everything I'm going to talk here is the qualification is it's the potential direction. But the New Jersey process, the stakeholder slides they had in their stakeholder meetings, as well as video recordings, are available on their website. If anyone's interested in those details, if you just Google New Jersey environmental justice, you can go to their page, will pop right up. And if you click on regulatory development, all the information is theirs. But I just do want to summarize kind of where they are at their last stakeholder meeting. They did provide an update in terms of the potential direction that they're thinking of. Next slide, please. So New Jersey's potential process really involves 3 steps. There's an initial screening step, then there's the development of an environmental justice impact statement, and then there's the department review and decision-making by the New Jersey DEP. So as a first step, New Jersey is considering this screening to determine if environmental and public health stressors in an overburdened community, because that's where the statute would apply, are higher than the most protective geographic point of comparison. And that's really looking at what the permit applicant would do, they'd have to look at the average of the stressors at both the state and county level, excluding other overburdened areas, and do a comparison process. The process basically requires you look at the different stressors and you calculate what New Jersey's calling a combined stressor total. And then when you make a comparison, New Jersey is considering higher than to mean greater than the 50th percentile. So that first screening would say, is the overburdened community where I'm proposing a facility or an expansion or a renewal of a permit, are the combined stressor totals higher than the most least most protective point of geographic comparison, which would be either the state or county level, whichever is more protective. And then as a second step, New Jersey is considering the development of an environmental justice impact statement. And this impact statement would be required in all cases, even if the combined stressor total is lower than the geographic point of comparison, you would still produce this environmental impact statement. So where the combined stressor total is lower than the geographic point of comparison, the applicant would prepare the state impact statement. They would have to conduct a public hearing and a comment period. The hearing would have to be located in the overburdened community, and they would assess whether the facility will contribute to existing environmental public health stressors such that they create stressors that are higher than the appropriate geographic point of comparison. And there would be steps outlined and taken to ensure that the permit in that case would not increase stressor levels so that they're higher than the geographic point of comparison. And then where the combined stressor total is higher than the geographic point of comparison and the facility would create a disproportionate impact, next slide, then in that case, when New Jersey reviews it for new facilities, if a disproportionate impact is created, then the New Jersey DEP would deny the permit unless there's a compelling public interest in the overburdened community. And that's another area that they're working on defining. So, and then in any case, in that case, they would impose binding permit conditions if it were allowed to go forward to avoid or minimize the health impacts. And under the New Jersey statute, if the facility is an expansion or a renewal permit, the agency can't deny the permit, but they could impose binding permit conditions concerning the construction operation of the facility. Next slide, please. So in all of this, when they do that initial comparison, the screening step, as well as the environmental justice impact statement, they are looking at environmental and public health stressors. And through their stakeholder process, New Jersey has narrowed down the list of stressors they're considering as a potential direction from over 60 that they've reviewed down to 31. And they're listed here. The statute provided some categories of stressors for the New Jersey DEP to consider. And then within these categories, they reviewed a number of stressors and then they picked some. So for instance, under the category of concentrated areas of air pollution, New Jersey DEP is considering ozone. So this would correspond to like number of ozone exceedance days. Also particle pollution, PM 2.5. They're also looking at cancer risk from diesel, which would be coming from the NADA data, the National Air Toxics Assessment data that Sandy mentioned earlier. They're also looking at non-cancer risk from the NADA data, and also the density of permitted air sites, air quality permitted sites in the area, in the census block. For mobile sources of air pollution, they're looking at things like traffic. This might be indicated by vehicle miles traveled or major roadways in the area, railways. Point sources of water pollution, they're looking at surface water quality indicators, combined sewer overflows. They're looking at solid waste facilities and scrap yards that are in the area of in the overburdened community. Contaminated sites such as contaminated soil or other contaminated properties that have deed restrictions. And then under the category of other indicators that may cause public health impacts, they're again looking at the number of regulated facilities in the community, age of housing, lack of recreational open space, poverty, minority status, et cetera. So they have a list of 31 stressors that they're considering. And Again, they have not proposed anything in regulations yet. This is all just under consideration. So they're still very much in the process of developing their proposal. And I think there's some, valuable things we can learn from New Jersey, but it's also important to note that the New Jersey approach is primarily a comparative analysis. And it's not really a cumulative impact analysis. And New Jersey has made that point themselves. So while they're looking at stressors and they're calculating combined stressor totals, the stressors aren't weighted. They don't really give you an indication of the total impact on the community, but they're really used for that comparative process. Does the overburdened community where the permit action is it more overburdened than other communities on a stressor by stressor level and at a combined stressor level? And that's really driven by the New Jersey law, which says no community should bear a disproportionate share of the adverse environmental and public health consequences that accompany the state's economic growth. So it's a comparative analysis, but again, I think there's some there's some useful information here, but it doesn't quite get at. I think our climate law has a different approach where it talks simply of a cumulative impact analysis for air permits, and there's no discussion of comparative analysis. Although, as we've mentioned earlier, it's I think whenever we talk about cumulative impact analysis, we are going to be concerned about disproportionate impact as well. Next slide. The second example is from the state of Minnesota in their cumulative levels and effects analysis. This is based on a 2008 law that directed the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to require the cumulative levels and effects analysis for all air permits in a specific area as defined in the statute. And that area ended up being this very small area in South Minneapolis. So while this law has been in place for quite a while, it currently applies to a very small area, and only 2 air permits have actually gone through the process, and a third is currently in the process. But I think the Minnesota program is relevant, very relevant to our process, because the statutory requirement is very similar to ours, requiring cumulative impact analysis for air permits. Their law states that the Minnesota agency may not issue a permit without first analyzing and considering the cumulative levels and effects of past and current environmental pollution from all sources on the environment and residents of the geographic area that may be affected by the facility's emissions. So it is a comprehensive look at both environmental and health related information in this area. And as I said, the program has been in place for a while. Minnesota has developed a number of supporting documents and guidance documents. There's a process document for permit applicants. There's also a reference document that includes a kind of list of available stressor data. So where can you find environmental data that you would use in your analysis, and health endpoint data as well. Next slide. So in terms of the Minnesota process, their process document lays out a number of steps for their cumulative levels and effects analysis. The first step is to submit criteria pollutant and air toxics modeling protocol to the agency for approval. And this is pretty standard in the air permit world. Criteria pollutants are those with national ambient air quality standards, such as particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, et cetera. And in any kind of air permit that's of any size, we would do this type of modeling. And also air toxics modeling protocol, which is also done here in the state of Massachusetts. Then the second step in Minnesota is to perform an air emission risk analysis, as well as the criteria pollutant modeling after the agency reviews the modeling protocol. The air emission risk analysis is called, or short for AERA, It evaluates and quantifies the potential human health risks due to the air pollution from the proposed project. And again, in that the facility emissions are modeled and the resulting air concentrations are compared to health benchmarks. For the criteria pollutants, that would be the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And then for the air toxics, it would look at non-cancer and cancer risk estimates for all the emission units at the facility, and then compare those to the general risk assessment guidelines of 1 for a hazard index and 1 in 100,000 for cancer risks. And those, you know, the hazard index concept and the cancer risk are fairly standard in risk assessment. After the modeling is done, the actual analysis would have to be scoped and defined. And there's a screening step in here, which I'll talk about in a second, just to identify the pollutants and the human and environmental health endpoints that are going to be included in the report. The analysis and report would be include both quantitative and qualitative information. So the quantitative would be, for instance, the risk estimates and comparisons to the NACs. But a lot of the other information, as Sandy mentioned earlier, is qualitative. There's a lot of different environmental health indicators that don't necessarily add up together. They're not numbers. They don't fit into an equation. So integrating this information is challenging. Minnesota does require public participation and community outreach. They encourage the permit applicant to engage in community outreach even prior to the permit application and developing the analysis report. And then there is a required comment period of, I think, 45 days, and public hearing and community meetings would be held based on the analysis report. And then Minnesota would review the permit, and they would consider the analysis in their permit decision making. Next slide, please. So this slide gives you a little bit more detail about the scoping and the data. So again, they do the air dispersion modeling to calculate the maximum air concentrations, and they compare the air concentrations with screening levels. And in Minnesota, for the air toxics, they've set the screening levels at basically 10% of the risk health benchmark. So rather than 1 in 100,000, the screening level is 0.1 in 100,000. And rather than 1 as the hazard index, it's 0.1. So if any of the levels are above that, they're screened in. And for criteria pollutants, the screening level is the significant impact level. And these significant impact levels are used commonly in air modeling. They're established by EPA. They're set at a fraction of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And if you're below those, EPA deems the emissions to create that are resulting concentrations below this. So they're deemed to not require further analysis because they do not threaten reaching the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So in the Minnesota process, if the screening levels are not, anything above the screening levels is not exceeded beyond the facility's property boundary, then no further cumulative impact analysis is required. If you do have levels above screening levels that go beyond the property boundary, then the applicant has to do the cumulative level and effect analysis and report. That would be focused on the pollutants that exceeded the screening levels, and those screening levels are very conservative. And then they would have to identify the human health endpoints that are associated with those specific pollutants. So the human health endpoint example might be, respiratory effects, cardiovascular, reproductive, neurological, cancer, et cetera. But they would be tied to those pollutants. And then they would list the types of environmental health data associated with the health endpoints to be included in the analysis. And these have 3 categories. They have hazard indicators, and this refers to things like typical environmental indicators in our parlance, like pollutant concentrations, air quality concentrations from nearby air monitoring sites, traffic density, surface water assessments, if there's fish tissue in the area, those concentrations, drinking water quality, et cetera. Hazardous waste generators. And then exposure indicators would be kind of biomarkers, so blood lead levels in children, if arsenic levels, if there's any of that type of biomonitoring, and then health indicators. So these would include things like the population health status, asthma, emergency room visits and hospitalizations, incidence of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, socioeconomic data, housing value, things along those levels. And that would all be in this report. Next slide, please. And the report, the analysis has a section where you discuss, some of the stressors and the vulnerabilities and the pathways you've looked at. Those would be described in the report. And this is just an analysis or an example taken from Minnesota's process document. So you can see for stressors, ambient air toxics measurements, and then it would have a general discussion of these indicators. And again, some are can be quantified, and others are more qualitative, but there's a comparison to other areas in the area. So this is just guidance from Minnesota. But the stressors include environmental pollutants, as well as non-chemical stressors and different endpoints. And the vulnerability descriptions, has asthma, hospitalization, et cetera. Next slide. And so the results of the cumulative levels and effects analysis are summarized in a report that includes an evaluation of the health data, the community stressors, describes potentials for exposure, and describes also mitigation and risk reduction. So that's important that the permit applicant would look at what their emission units are. Have they done anything to avoid emissions or reduce impacts? And then the statute does not, establish any unique emission limits or set thresholds. So beyond looking at compliance with National Ambient Air Quality Standards and meeting the air toxics benchmarks, the additional kind of criteria are considered by the agency and the board in their decision-making and regulatory process. So again, in terms of the decision-making piece, it's not laid out very clearly about how they do that, which is, again, another challenge when you're trying to integrate all these different indicators that don't necessarily fit into an equation. So I think in summary, we've talked about the different terminology and the tools we have, some examples of, using cumulative impact analysis or considering cumulative impacts in air permit decisions. And I think given this, we wanted to go back to the questions that were posed at the beginning. Any questions to me on what I've discussed, as well as the overall questions that we wanted to open up to.
Glenn, we do have a few questions and a comment. So we'll start with the comment. Looks like on slide 36, you had a list of the stressors from New Jersey. And someone just had a comment that New Jersey actually has a very long list of stressors that go far beyond what was listed on the slide there.
Yes, these were just some examples. If you go to the slide deck for New Jersey's final or sixth stakeholder meeting, there's 31 stressors that are listed. I didn't duplicate them all, but there are 31. There's more than what's on that slide.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. And then a few questions. So when the Massachusetts DEP is looking at environmental and public health stressors, how will airports be considered as a form of air pollution?
That's a very good question. But I think it would be integrated in some way. I mean, we haven't gotten to that point yet. I think one of the discussions we want to have is, what are the environmental indicators that we want to consider in the cumulative impact analysis? So I think airports are certainly sources of air emissions. And so I don't know exactly what data we would have on that, but that would definitely be something to consider, and how that would be evaluated in a cumulative impact analysis.
Great. And before I move on to the next question, just a reminder that if you do want to ask your question verbally, feel free to select that raised hand icon and we can unmute you. But we do have a few more. So this one's from Betsy Sowers. It says, it looks like that in Minnesota, public meetings and comments in the AJ community are held on the gathered data before the permit is drafted, and that the CLNE is included in the drafting of the permit. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't think it's a requirement that meetings are held prior to, but Minnesota encourages it. I think the only regulatory requirement is that once the report, the permit application, and the analysis is subject to a extended public comment period, which I believe is 45 days. But the community involvement upfront is encouraged in Minnesota's guidance. I don't think it's a requirement, though.
Great. And another question, with the exposure to all types of toxins increasing to dangerous levels in all communities, measuring only the relative exposure in an EJ community to non-EJ community seems like good, but very partial strategy. Should it known health and environmental risks of stressors when they are above safe limits should it known health and environmental risks of stressors when they are above safe limits should be the primary criterion?
Yeah, that's a good observation, because as I mentioned, in New Jersey, they're doing a comparative analysis. Now, even though they're doing a comparative analysis with these additional indicators, they still are, as part of their core air permit program, ensuring that any emissions would meet, national ambient air quality standards and air toxic standards that they already have in place. New Jersey does have a robust program for permitting and addressing air toxics and other pollutants. So that's the baseline. I think what New Jersey is doing is going beyond that, saying that even if you meet all the standards, you might not get your permit if this facility is going to increase a burden in an overburdened area. So yes, the comment is well taken, that at a minimum you have to ensure that whatever permits you issue ensure adequate protection of public health and environment. That's kind of a non-negotiable.
Great, thank you. And it looks like Cynthia Lupi has her hand raised. So Cynthia, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. I so appreciate this conversation, and thank you, Keith, for this really thorough overview. It seems to me, thinking back to some of the input from some of our technical advisors from the BU School of Public Health, that one of the most interesting pieces of these questions are the qualitative as well as quantitative inputs to some of these assessments, that there are some things that are very numbers based and that can be numbers based in terms of concentrations of pollution, and that there are other things like you sort of hint at in the questions around some of the social determinants of health and housing quality, access to healthcare, what the general poverty levels are that are adding to health burdens in the area, that those are some of the things that are, from our perspective, I think really critical in looking at cumulative burdens, because they interact with pollution levels in different ways, as from our perspective, and I think from other health researchers. If you look at how COVID played out in some of these communities, it provides some similar themes. So from our perspective, I think including finding a pathway to include some of those qualitative issues, systematically in an assessment like this is really critical. And as I've heard from my colleagues in New Jersey, and I think we feel like if you look at those burdens and the existing air pollution burdens combined, there are some communities that should just not be considered for additional pollution sources, just across the board. There are some that it might be appropriate to move forward with a lot of conditions put on new facilities, but there are some communities that just can't or shouldn't be asked to shoulder more burdens. So from our perspective, finding a pathway to really assess that in terms of the qualitative issues is really critical. So just really appreciate you opening up this kind of discussion so that we can share that input.
Thanks. That's a really great comment, and that is the approach New Jersey's taken, and I think it's, and again, even though our statute isn't as specific as New Jersey's, I think that's an issue that we have to address as well in our process.
Thank you, Cynthia, for your comments. It doesn't look like we have any other questions at this time.
So as we're waiting, just to make sure we haven't missed any questions, I just want to put up the last slide, just so people have the contact information. We just want to make sure everybody knows that we receive any comments or input. Up to I think about 3 weeks after the stakeholder meeting, so that if we get significant input, we can just summarize it at the next meeting. But we continually accept input and comments throughout the process. And that's that first massdep.impact@mass.gov is where you can submit or continue to submit input and comments. We just want to make sure everyone's aware of that. If you want to be included in our distribution list, you submit your information at the link at the second point, which then all of this information is on our website, and that is the website link, or you just Google, cumulative impact analysis and air permitting, and you will get to that link. Also, what we talked about at our first stakeholder meeting is that there is a MEPA process ongoing. It's going at a little bit faster pace because of the requirements in the climate law for MEPA, with some things that overlap with what we're doing. They also have some other requirements that they need to do as well. They need to do some regulation changes by the end of the year. And so they have some separate processes that they're doing, but we are sharing information and cross-fertilizing each process this fall, and also MEPA will be interested in what we continue to do with our process, going even beyond their regulations that they need to propose by the end of the year as well. And so we have their information input as well on that slide, which will be when we post the slides on the website. You'll have that information. So we just want to highlight that again. So are there any other questions, Maggie?
We just one so far. People are wondering if they can get a copy of the presentation.
It will be posted on the website, just like the first presentation is there. And also you will have a link to this recording on our YouTube channel for MassDEP. So it will all be available on the website, the slides and the YouTube recording.
Great. And we don't have any other questions at this time. I don't see any hands being raised.
And again, we definitely want to thank everybody for participating, and some great comments and very thoughtful input. And we look forward to continuing this conversation through our stakeholder process. And please keep aware and distribute information. There will be an evening meeting tomorrow night for those who couldn't make a daytime meeting at 6 o'clock, I believe we start tomorrow night. So, and the schedule of our future stakeholder meetings is also on the website.
So someone's asking if you could show the slide with the questions again.
Certainly.
Great, thank you.
And right now we will stay a few more minutes. I think we will end the meeting, but we will stay for the next 5 minutes or so before we close the Zoom meeting in case anyone else has a question, but feel free to depart if you wish. Well, looks like there's a question.
All right, perfect. So Catherine Robertson, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to speak.
Yeah, I think I just did. Yeah, I've been sort of playing with asking this question or not because it's not well formed. So I'll probably ramble a little bit, which is why I couldn't put it in writing. But, you know, I think along this process, there hasn't really been a point made yet. I represent the Massachusetts Chemistry and Technology Alliance. And our concern, or the concern of some of our members, is primarily, you know, knowing what's going to happen. You know, sort of, you know, we're looking for. I'm trying to think of the right term. As I said, I'm not focused right now, but just basically so we know what we're looking at. And I think when we're talking about qualitative impacts, which I think are relevant, that sort of, you know, I guess the big question is, when is the decision going to be made about what permits are going to be impacted by this?
Right.
Because we haven't gotten to that point yet, have we?
No, we haven't.
Okay.
So yeah, and that is a question, an issue that we're going to be addressing in an upcoming stakeholder meeting. You can look at the schedule that's on our website. I believe currently that's scheduled for maybe January timeframe, but that is an issue that we've noted that we need to address.
Yeah, because one of the things that a couple of my members have just, you know, talked to me about is, again, it's not objecting to what's being done. I mean, this is important stuff you're dealing with. It's just having a level of certainty about what this could mean. You know, is this going to be for operating permits for people that are up, you know, already existing in communities? Is this only going to be for new permits? It's, you know, where are we, you know, where is this going? And so I think that meeting is going to be an important one. So I just wanted to check with you on that, and also raise the issue of providing folks that, you know, are operating in impacted communities of a certain level of certainty about what they need to do and what they need to look at, and not being given ever-changing benchmarks and that sort of thing. So, because when you're making business decisions, you're making them years out. So,
right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sure. Thanks for the comment.
All right, we received a written question. So do any of the participants have a comment on what types of things like cumulative impacts would not be captured in the screening tools that have been shown? That would be great. That would be a great help to the state policymakers.
Sandy has an comment on that.
I'd say in general, there's data that we might be really interested in, but is very difficult to present at a level that is protective of individuals' privacy, to present it in a public sort of facing tool. So that might be something that policy, those kinds of endpoints might be something that policy and communities are interested in, that we might just be constrained by the way the data is collected, and sort of what level of analysis is appropriate for sharing. There's many types of data that are collected by the different agencies, and one thing that we will need to be aware of is that sometimes we're looking at these data as indicators for particular environment or health sort of attributes, and sometimes one data source is actually very closely correlated to another data source. And even though they look like they're two individual things, and our brains think about them as two individual things, they actually are predictive of each other. And so those types of data, we would want to have the endpoint that has sort of the stronger data source be the representative indicator, versus including both of them, because then you might overweight that particular attribute. But I can't really, sort of beyond that, I can't really say what would be excluded at this point in time. It really, comes down to, availability, the quality of the information, and its ability to be shared publicly. Those are sort of the main criteria for data that could be included. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. So as a follow-up, they're also interested to know if anyone from the audience would care to provide their input as well. So if you have anything to add, please go ahead and raise your hand, and we can call on you to unmute. Just as a reminder, I'll repeat the question. Do any of the participants have a comment on what types of things like cumulative impacts would not be captured in the screening tools that have been shown? This would be a great help to the state policymakers. So if anyone wants to chime in, feel free to raise your hand. And while folks do that, we can go on to the next question. So this next question is, what/who triggers the need for a cumulative impact assessment?
Maggie, could you say that again? I don't know if I heard it correctly.
Sure. What/who triggers the need for a cumulative impact assessment?
Okay, go ahead, Glenn. Sorry.
Yeah, so in our context, it would be a permit applicant. So if someone is applying to DEP for an air permit, we haven't defined exactly which permits, because the statute talks about incorporating cumulative impact analysis into certain air quality permits. So not all air permits, but some air permits, the applicant, when they apply, that would trigger a cumulative impact analysis. And again, we haven't defined exactly what that is, which permits, and is it everywhere, or is it only in or near environmental justice communities? Those are still issues that we have to discuss. But it's the permit application that for an under our air quality program that triggers the need to do the cumulative impact analysis as part of the other permit application requirements.
Thanks, Glenn. There are no other questions at this time.
Okay, we'll give it a minute or so more and then probably conclude the meeting. Okay, thank you all again. If there aren't, you don't see any more, Maggie, questions or hands?
Nope, nothing else.
Okay, thank you all for attending and we appreciate all of your discussion and questions and we hope to see you at the next stakeholder meeting and please feel free if you did not wish to put in a comment during the meeting, feel free to add it on the website, to add it to the comment at the mailbox. And we would like to still get your comments and input at any time after this meeting. Thank you very much.